We've sold like a couple of thousand of these things since we started this channel. It's not how fast you go, it's how you go fast. It's the philosophy of this channel. Because I'll tell you what, ultimately, the fastest guy is always going to be the guy with the most money to spend. If you only base your fun or your ambitions with your car around cars about being the fastest guy out there, unless you're the richest guy out there, you're always going to come up disappointed. You're never going to get the satisfaction that this sport has to offer. Speed does cost money. It's not just a cliche, it's the truth. How fast do you want to go? And ultimately, it's the guy with the deepest pockets that goes the fastest. And it doesn't matter what type of racing it is. It could be Formula One, it could be NASCAR, it could be Top Fuel, it could be Street Outlaws. It doesn't make any difference. The guy with the deepest pockets can buy the best parts, the most parts. He can buy the talent, he can buy the brains, he can buy the technology. He buys all of these things. He buys the test time, he buys the facility to do the test time in. You can't beat that. You can't beat that. If there's a pool of 1,000 people racing, the one guy that has the most money, able to allocate the most resources, is going to win. He's going to be the fastest. That's the bottom line. So how do you find satisfaction with this if you know you're never going to be the, quote, fastest guy out there? So for this, I got to tell a story that seems like it's a little off topic, but trust me, it'll all make sense as we go along. So go back to 1987. I was doing Cars Illustrated magazine at the time, and back then, cars, the modern muscle car didn't really exist. They were out there. They were building them. IROCs, and they were building 5-liter Mustangs and Grand Nationals. They were building all of these cars, but nobody in the hot rod community ever took them seriously. We were all still messing around with cars from the late 60s, early 70s. Big blocks, traditional stuff. Nobody took the modern cars seriously. Then the Mustangs started to get a little bit of an edge over the others, and they were down in the 14s. And to have a modern muscle car running in the 14s, again, this is like 1986, in the early part of 1987, was a huge deal. That meant that these cars were now capable. They were on par with the cars from the 60s and the 70s in stock form, because that's about what they ran. So in 1987, the spring of 1987, I bought a Mustang, and it was a bare stripper, 5-liter, 5-speed. And I did a drag test on it for Cars Illustrated magazine. Cars Illustrated magazine later on evolved into Muscle Mustangs and Fast Fords, basically as a result of what I'm talking about right now. So I buy the car and I do it. The first day that I had it, brought it from the dealership to the drag strip. Just like that, no stops in between. And the first day that we had the car, it ran like I didn't know how to drive it. It just spun the tires. It was a 5-liter, 5-speed, bare stripper, notchback through a gear. That was it. Not even a radio. Car spun. I wasn't really too thrilled with it. We go out a second time, and I started driving it a little less aggressively, because I had started driving it like I was driving my old mopars. You know, just brutalize the thing, go down the track. And the Mustang didn't want that. The Mustang wanted some finesse. So the second time we take the car out, it ran someplace down in the 1390s. And I was like, oh my God, this thing is lightning fast. That started a whole thing. My buddy Neil Van Opry, who also worked for Cars Illustrated, as well as a few other magazines at the time, he bought a Mustang also. And now there was a rivalry between the two of us. Who's going to get the best numbers out of it? Steve Collison from Superstock and Drag Illustrated also got one of these Mustangs, Mean Mr. Mustang. And he was down there in that range. And then all of a sudden, this whole tribe of people started buying these 5-liter Mustangs and hitting all of these test and tune nights. And it was who's going to be the first into the 1380s? Who's going to be the first into the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, the 40s? Who's going to be the first in the 12s? The important thing to remember about this era now is that there was no internet. There was no forums or any way for us to communicate other than the phone. And we would go out to these test and tune nights, like Englishtown Wednesday night. I'd get home from the track at like 11 o'clock and then start dialing up people from all over the country. Hey, I just ran a so-and-so, I did this, I did that, I just ran a so-and-so. Oh yeah, well, I just ran blah, blah, blah. And this guy just ran blah, blah, blah. And we'd be on the phone all night, like comparing notes. We were bench racing over the phone. And it wasn't so much who was getting to the other end first. It was this competition amongst us who was getting the most out of their Mustangs without any parts, because that's the other thing you have to remember about this. The 5-liter Mustang was a new thing. I mean, it had been in production for a few years, but the movement was new. There was no aftermarket for this. There were no cams, there were no intakes, there were no computers, there was nothing. There was just what the factory supplied with these cars at first, and this is what we were working with. Hindsight, you look back and you say, you know, almost 40 years later, and you say, well, running 13s with a 5-liter Mustang is nothing. You know, people running the 7s all day long with 4i. No, it was a different world. The parts didn't exist for these fuel-injected engines. And I get a lot of heat about being a carburetor guy, you know, a fuel-injected world. But back in the 1980s, I was all about fuel injection, and we were running fuel injection cars. This was it. I was on the cutting edge of all of this movement that was going on. So we ran these cars. There was, like I said, a tribe of people across the country, all with 5-liter Mustangs, all hitting their test and tunes, and all trying to eke out that 1,000th of a second, or the 100th or the 1,000th, every little bit, all using our brains, racking our brains, trying to figure out how to make these cars with their stock parts run as fast as they possibly could. And it was the most fun I have ever had with cars. And I've done a lot of stuff with cars, but that was it. When I look back at that period of time, that summer of 1987, when it was all new and it was all stock, and we were just flogging and pulling our hair out and racking our brains and sitting up all night trying to scheme and connive and figure out ways to make this thing go just that much faster. It was a blast. That's where the magic was. So what does that have to do with this 318? Mission Impossible. Project Mission Impossible. Well, that's what we're doing with this in essence. What we're going to do is we're going to take, and this is a team now, this is us working with David Vizard, and I don't have to tell you who David Vizard is. He is a living legend. People talk about like Smokey Yunick, and well, David was buddies with Smokey Yunick. These guys used to compare notes. This is a brain trust that's just over the top. So we're working with David, and we're working with Andy from Unity Motorsports Garage, who also works with David. And when I mentioned this idea to David, he sparked up. He thought it was brilliant. He wants to get involved in it. He wants to do this because he sees the challenge. He sees the fun in making these low performance parts try to do something that would seem to be impossible. How do you get 1 horsepower per cubic inch out of this? That's the challenge. That's the fun. You know, like the Engine Masters thing, the competition. It's a brilliant event. It showcases the greatest minds in all of engine building, but I always thought it kind of missed the mark a little bit because like it's a blank slate. It's like, you know, just build what you're going to build, one what you brung. You're not really pitting these guys' wits against each other directly. In my mind, a competition like that would be like each guy gets an identical engine, and they're limited to X parts, whatever those parts happen to be. Who's going to make the most power out of that exact combination? That's really showing who's the smartest guy out there, not necessarily who's got the biggest budget or the most time to spend on the dyno or the... Make any sense? So that's what we're doing here. That's what Mission Impossible is, to take a 318 with all stock or replacement internals and a stock intake manifold and a stock BBD carburetor and get this thing to make 1 horsepower per cubic inch. It's a job. These were rated when up until 1971, they were rated at 230 horsepower at the flywheel, which is how they were rated. During the muscle car era, engines were rated, the horsepower ratings were taken on the dyno, just the engine. It was only after 1971, 1972, that they started where it had to be with all of the accessories in place and through drivetrain. And so that's the difference between gross and net. So rated the old way, the way this thing will sit on a dyno, these engines were rated at 230 horsepower. They were not designed for performance in any way, shape, or form. The whole intent of the 318 was to be the basic bread and butter engine. This was something that was just going to motor down the road in taxis and police cars and delivery vans and station wagons, and just the basic engine. Its prime directive was to be reliable and get good fuel economy. No pretense to performance whatsoever. So a lot of people, when we talked about this project, announced this project a couple of days ago, people were like, well, why don't you use a Magnum? Why don't you use a 360? Because those engines, you expect to make power from those engines. It's a no-brainer to make power from those engines. They're good engines. Nobody ever had a Magnum and said, yeah, I'm going to get rid of this piece of junk and I'm going to plug a 318 in. Never happened. Same thing with 360s. Nobody ever said, oh, I got this 360. I'm just going to leave this thing on the side of the garage and I'm going to put a 318 in there. Nobody's ever done that. And that's the appeal of working with this 318, because it's not supposed to make horsepower. That's the challenge. It's not supposed to work. That's why David is stoked about this, because it's an impossible thing. How do you make this package make 1 horsepower per cubic inch and stay true to its original design? So here's the parameters with this. This is the block that we're going to use. These are the head castings we're going to use. This is the intake manifold, and this is a carburetor I'm going to send to Andy so we can get started on this, because this is really going to be the bottleneck to it. But I'll get to that in a minute. So David is taking the lead on this. He's the boss, and he's going to tell Andy and I what he needs us to supply, what we need to do. So I'm going to supply all of these parts. I'll prep them to spec. The block will get bored. It'll get bored 60 over, but the replacement pistons will have stock compression height for the year engine that this is, which is 1972. It's the same 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. It'll get bored 60 over. The crank will get offset ground. Not so much to pick up cubic inch, but to raise the pistons up the hole a little bit, build a little bit more compression. It'll get decked, the heads will get surfaced. It'll be all basically standard machine work, but done with an eye towards maximizing these particular parts. Head porting is going to be an interesting endeavor. I'm dying to see what David comes up with this. I know he's already, his wheels are already turning on it. He's already working on this in his head. So I'm curious to see what he's going to do with these heads exactly. We're going to run into the choke points on this are going to be the cam. Because now if you're going to use a stock cam, you're talking about a 390 thousandths lift cam, right? And it's got like a 114 LSA. It's like a terrible cam. There's going to be some trickery with the cam. Again, we could just order any cam on earth, but making this cam work, that's going to be interesting. Same thing with rockers. We'll probably mess around with rocker arm ratios. Remember, there's the stock parts, but we can modify them any way we see fit. So there will definitely be grinding and metal removal and trickery and whatever to attain that goal, and we will meet the goal. 1 horsepower per cubic inch out of this. And this, like I said, this is the stumbling. This is the real. This is a BBD. It's an 1872 BBD. These things are rated at 285 CFM. But Andy knows the tricks. Andy is a carburetor guru, and let's see how much flow he can get out of one of these things. Now, what we're doing is definitely unique. It's not completely unheard of. Lower class stock eliminator racers, like the UVW stock automatic, they've been running these little 318s and 273s down into the 13-second range for decades. And we'll be employing a lot of those tricks into this package. And they run those numbers in 4,000-pound station wagons using these carburetors and these intake manifolds. But lots and lots of tricks. And that's really the crux of this build. It's like the tricks. What kind of tricks, what kind of science, what can we do to this thing to make it produce those numbers? That's where the fun is. Just like making those time shots with our completely stock Mustangs. I remember making runs with that car and being so excited about what was going to pop up on the time slip that I remember going through the traps, and as I'm going through the traps, I'd be going like this, looking at the scoreboard, trying to catch a glimpse of the number. That's the kind of excitement that I'm wanting to bring back around with this package, and I think we're going to get it. It'll be fun. It'll definitely be different, and it'll be something that really anybody can afford. The machine work that's going to be done to this is really, it's going to be the same cost and the same machine work, but just done in a specific way to maximize this package. So we're not really doing anything out of the ordinary that wouldn't be done during a complete rebuild, freshen up type of thing. So this is attainable for anybody who wants to do it. And without saying, obviously, if it'll work on this, it'll work on a higher performance engine. So anything we do to this can be applied to your 340, your 360, your Windsor Ford, your Chevy. It can all be applied across the board. So that's what we're doing with this. And that's mission impossible. And my next step is to just take this block, get it deburred, so that we can drop it off over at Andy's and see where it goes from there. So that's it for now. Now I hope you got a grasp of what we're doing with this thing. You understand the hows and the whys. And I'll see you tomorrow.